The train lurched to a stop, and Evelyn Mercer gripped the rail as her bad leg buckled beneath her weight. She'd traveled 900 miles to marry a man she'd never met, a rancher who promised her safety, a home, maybe even something close to love. But when she limped down onto the platform and he saw the way her right foot dragged against the wooden boards, his expression shifted from curiosity to revulsion in less than 3 seconds. He turned his back without a single word and walked away, leaving her standing there with her suitcase and the entire town watching. If you're curious how a woman nobody wanted became the most talked about rancher in the Arizona Territory, stay with me until the end. And if this story finds you, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see just how far Evelyn's journey travels. The heat in Blackstone Ridge didn't just sit on your skin. It crawled inside your lungs and made every breath feel like swallowing broken glass. Evelyn stood on that train platform with sweat already soaking through the back of her traveling dress, watching the man who was supposed to be her husband disappear into the crowd without so much as a backwards glance. His name was Vernon Hadley. She'd memorized it from the letters he'd sent back to Missouri, letters full of promises about wide-open land and a ranch house with a porch where she could sit in the evenings. He'd written that he needed a strong woman, someone willing to work hard and build a life beside him. He'd never asked about her leg. She'd never told him. Stupid. That's what her sister had called her when she'd announced she was heading west to marry a stranger. Desperate, her mother had said, which hurt worse because it was true. At 27, Evelyn had watched every eligible man in her town choose someone else. Someone who could dance at socials, someone who didn't grimace when they walked more than a block, someone whose right leg hadn't been crushed under a wagon wheel when she was 12. The platform began to empty. Families collecting their luggage, ranch hands loading supply crates onto wagons, a pair of cowboys arguing about a poker game from the night before. Nobody looked at her. Or maybe they did. Quick sideways glances before turning away like she was something embarrassing they'd accidentally seen. She picked up her suitcase, everything she owned fit inside it, and started toward the station house. Her legs screamed with each step, the muscles seizing up after sitting cramped on a train for 3 days. She'd learned to ignore pain a long time ago, but ignoring the stairs was harder. "You the mail-order bride Hadley was supposed to collect?" The voice came from an older woman sitting on a bench in the shade, fanning herself with a folded newspaper. Her face was weathered like old leather, eyes sharp and knowing. "I suppose I was," Evelyn said. The woman made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a cough. "Figures. Vernon Hadley's got particular tastes. Wants a woman who can work like a mule but look like one of them fancy catalog pictures. Fool never did understand you can't have both." "Do you know where I might find a boarding house?" "Boarding house?" The woman's eyebrows lifted. "Honey, there's only one place in this town that takes in single women, and you don't want to work there." She paused, letting that sink in. "Unless you're truly desperate." Evelyn's fingers tightened on the suitcase handle. She had $12 left after buying her train ticket. Maybe enough for a week's room and board if she was lucky, if she ate sparingly, if she didn't need anything else. After that, she didn't let herself think about after that. "There's a church," the woman continued, her tone softening slightly. "Reverend Matthews sometimes lets travelers sleep in the back room if they're respectful and don't cause trouble. Might be your best option until you figure things out." "Thank you." Evelyn started walking before the woman could see the tears burning in her eyes. 3 days on a train, 900 miles from everything she'd ever known, and her best option was charity from a church that would probably pity her just like everyone else. The main street of Blackstone Ridge was exactly like the dozens of other frontier towns she'd passed through. Wooden buildings with false fronts, a saloon on one corner, a general store on the other, horses tied to hitching posts and dust covering everything. The sun hammered down from a sky so blue it looked painted. A group of men were standing outside the saloon, and one of them said something as she passed. She didn't catch the words, but she heard the laughter that followed. Her face burned. The church was at the far end of town, a modest wooden structure with a crooked cross on top. Evelyn had almost reached it when she heard footsteps behind her. "Miss Mercer?" She turned, a young man, maybe 20, with a sunburned face and nervous hands. He pulled his hat off as he approached. "I'm Tom Bailey. I work for Mr. Hadley. The kid looked miserable. "He asked me to give you this." He held out an envelope. Evelyn took it, her fingers trembling slightly. He also said to tell you there's a train heading back east tomorrow morning. He'll cover the ticket. Of course he would. Getting rid of her was worth the expense. Tom Bailey shuffled his feet, looking like he wanted to say something else, but didn't know how. Finally, he just nodded, put his hat back on, and walked away. Evelyn didn't open the envelope right away. She already knew what it would say, some half-hearted apology, maybe a few dollars to ease his conscience. She shoved it into her pocket and kept walking. The church door was unlocked. Inside, the air was marginally cooler, and the silence felt like a small mercy. Evelyn sank onto the nearest pew and let herself cry for exactly 2 minutes. Then she wiped her face, took a deep breath, and opened the envelope. It contained $20 and a single sentence written in hasty script. "I'm sorry, but this wouldn't have worked." She almost laughed. $20. Like that made up for ripping her entire future apart. The Reverend found her an hour later, still sitting in that pew. He was a thin man with kind eyes and the slightly worn look of someone who'd spent too many years trying to save people who didn't want saving. "You must be Miss Mercer," he said gently. "Mrs. Patterson from the general store told me you might be here." Word traveled fast in small towns. "I don't mean to impose," Evelyn said. "I just need a place to stay for tonight. I'll be gone tomorrow." "You're welcome to stay as long as you need." He sat down on the pew across from her. "Though I have to tell you, heading back east might not be as simple as you think." "Why not?" "The train that brought you in? That's the weekly line. Next eastbound doesn't come through for 6 more days." 6 days. 6 days in a town where everyone already knew she'd been rejected, where she'd have to walk past Vernon Hadley and his pitying ranch hand and all those laughing men outside the saloon. "There's a room behind the church," the Reverend continued. "It's not much, but it's clean and private. You can stay there. And if you're looking for work to pass the time, Mrs. Patterson mentioned she could use help at the store." Charity again. But Evelyn swallowed her pride and nodded. "Thank you, Reverend." That night, lying on a narrow cot in the church's back room, Evelyn stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out where everything had gone wrong. She'd been careful. She'd answered Vernon's advertisement honestly. Well, mostly honestly. She told him she was strong, capable, not afraid of hard work. All true. She'd mentioned she came from a farming family, that she knew how to cook and sew and manage a household. Also true. She just hadn't mentioned the limp. Stupid. Her sister's voice echoed in her head. Desperate. Maybe both. The next morning, Evelyn woke before dawn and forced herself to get up. Lying in bed wouldn't change anything. She washed her face in the basin the Reverend had left, pinned her hair back, and put on the same dress she'd worn yesterday. It was the nicest one she owned, which wasn't saying much. Mrs. Patterson's general store opened at 7. Evelyn arrived at 6:30 and waited outside until the older woman showed up with a ring of keys. "You're early," Mrs. Patterson said, but she didn't sound displeased. "Come on in." The store smelled like coffee and leather and tobacco. Mrs. Patterson moved through it with practiced efficiency, lighting lamps, opening the register, checking inventory. "You ever worked in a store before?" she asked. "No, ma'am, but I'm a fast learner." Mrs. Patterson studied her for a moment, then nodded. "We'll start you on stocking shelves and keeping things organized. 30 cents a day, 6 days a week, Sundays off. You work hard, we'll see about increasing that after a month." 30 cents a day. Barely enough to survive, but it was something. Evelyn accepted. The work was simple but physical, lifting crates, organizing supplies, sweeping floors. Her leg protested every movement, especially after the first few hours, but Evelyn gritted her teeth and kept going. She'd spent 15 years learning to work through pain. This was no different. Customers came and went throughout the day. Most ignored her. A few stared at her limp with undisguised curiosity. One older woman asked Mrs. Patterson in a loud whisper if it was true she'd been abandoned at the train station, and Evelyn felt her face burn while pretending not to hear. Around midday, Vernon Hadley walked in. Evelyn was in the back corner, reorganizing a shelf of canned goods. She saw him before he saw her, and for a split second she considered hiding. But pride, stupid, useless pride, kept her exactly where she was. He was handsome in a conventional way. Tall, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven. The kind of man who knew he was good-looking and expected the world to accommodate him because of it. He was talking to Mrs. Patterson about an order of fence posts when he glanced over and their eyes met. His expression shifted, surprise, then discomfort, then something that might have been guilt. He looked away quickly. Evelyn turned back to the shelf and kept working. She heard him finish his business and leave without saying a word to her. Good. She had nothing to say to him either. That evening, exhausted and aching, Evelyn walked back to the church. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if she'd been in the mood to appreciate beauty. Instead, she was counting days. 5 more until the train came. 5 more days of whispers and stares, and Vernon Hadley's careful avoidance. She almost didn't see the man sitting on the church steps until she was nearly on top of him. He was old, 60, maybe older, with a face like cracked adobe and hands that shook slightly when he lifted them to shield his eyes from the setting sun. His clothes were covered in dust, and his horse, tied loosely to the church rail, looked as worn out as he did. "You the girl that got left at the station?" he asked. Evelyn's jaw tightened. "Is there anyone in this town who doesn't know about that? Small town. Word travels." He coughed, a wet rattling sound. "Named Silas Granger. I own Cross Creek Ranch about 8 miles north of here. I'm not interested in charity. Wasn't offering charity." He coughed again, harder this time. "I need help." There was something in the way he said it. Not desperate exactly, but close. Evelyn studied him more carefully. His face was flushed despite the cooling evening air, and now that she was paying attention, she could see the way he was favoring his left side, like something hurt. "What kind of help?" she asked carefully. "The kind that keeps a ranch from dying." He met her eyes. "I got sick 3 weeks back. Infection from a cut that went bad. Laid me out for 2 weeks, and in that time everything went to hell. Fences down, cattle scattered, crops dying. My hired hands quit, said they weren't going to work for a dead man." "You don't look dead." "Not yet. But I need someone who can work, and I need them now. Not next week, not next month, now." "Why me?" "Because you're here, and you're desperate, and I'm desperate, and maybe that's enough." He shifted, wincing. "I can offer room and board, and when the ranch starts turning a profit again, I'll pay you a fair wage. If it doesn't, well, at least you'll have a roof over your head and food to eat while you figure out what's next." It was possibly the least romantic job offer Evelyn had ever heard. No promises, no guarantees, just honest desperation meeting honest need. "I don't know anything about ranching," she said. "You know how to work hard." "Yes." "You know how to follow directions?" "Yes." "Then you know enough." He stood up slowly, like his whole body hurt. "I'm heading back tonight. You can come with me if you want, or you can wait here for that train. Your choice." Evelyn thought about those 5 remaining days, about Vernon Hadley's careful avoidance and the whispers that followed her everywhere, and Mrs. Patterson's 30 cents a day that would never be enough to build any kind of future. She thought about going back to Missouri with her tail between her legs, proving her sister right, proving her mother right, proving every man who'd ever looked past her exactly right. Or she could take a chance on a dying ranch with a sick old man who was honest enough to admit he was desperate. Not much of a choice, really. "I'll need to get my things," she said. Silas nodded. "I'll wait." The ride to Cross Creek Ranch took almost 2 hours in the dark. Silas didn't talk much, just focused on staying upright in the saddle. Evelyn rode behind him on a borrowed horse, Mrs. Patterson's, obtained with a quick explanation and a promise to return it, and tried not to think too hard about what she was doing. The ranch appeared gradually as they rode. First the outline of buildings against the starlit sky, then the shapes of fences and corrals, then finally the house itself, a long, low structure that looked like it was held together by willpower, and not much else. Silas dismounted carefully and led her inside. The house smelled like sickness and neglect. Unwashed dishes, stale air, something rotten somewhere. A single lamp burned on the kitchen table, illuminating the disaster around it. "I know it's bad," Silas said quietly. "It's been bad for a while now." He showed her to a small room off the kitchen, a maid's quarters probably, though it didn't look like anyone had used it in years. There was a bed with a thin mattress and a window that looked out toward what might have been fields once. "Get some rest," he said. "We'll start in the morning." But Evelyn didn't rest. She lay in that unfamiliar bed listening to Silas cough in the next room and wondering what kind of infection left a man this week, 3 weeks later. She wondered if the ranch was really salvageable or if she'd just traded one disaster for another. She wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. But she didn't get back on that horse and ride back to town. That had to count for something. Morning came early and harsh. Evelyn woke to sunlight streaming through the dirty window and the sound of Silas moving around in the kitchen. When she emerged, he was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, his face drawn and pale. "You stayed," he said, like he'd half expected her to run. "I stayed." "Good." He pushed himself to his feet. "Let me show you what needs doing." The tour of Cross Creek Ranch was brutal in its honesty. The fences were in shambles, posts rotted through, wire sagging. The cattle that remained were scattered across the range, half wild and uncounted. The barn roof leaked. The irrigation system was clogged. The vegetable garden was nothing but dead plants and weeds. "How long have you been alone out here?" Evelyn asked. 6 years. Had help until about a month ago. But like I said, people don't want to work for a dying man. "You're not dying." "Not today, anyway." He looked at her. "Can you handle this?" Evelyn looked at the devastation around her. Years of neglect and weeks of abandonment all piled together. Her leg was already aching from the ride last night and the walking this morning. She had no idea how to fix fences or herd cattle or repair irrigation systems. But she'd crossed 900 miles to build a new life, and she'd be damned if she gave up just because it was hard. "Yes," she said, "I can handle it." They started with the house because Silas needed rest, and Evelyn needed to understand what she was working with. She spent the first day just cleaning, scrubbing dishes, sweeping floors, opening windows to air out the staleness. She found the source of the rotten smell, a dead rat in the pantry. She threw it out, along with half the food supplies that had gone bad. Silas watched her work with a kind of quiet amazement, like he couldn't quite believe she was real. "When's the last time anyone cleaned this place?" she asked, scrubbing dried food off a plate. "My wife used to keep it nice," he said, "but she died 4 years back. I guess I just stopped caring after that." Evelyn didn't know what to say to that, so she kept scrubbing. On the second day, she moved outside. The garden was beyond saving, but she cleared out the dead plants and turned the soil, preparing it for whenever they could afford seeds. The work was hard, and by midday her hands were blistered and her leg was screaming, but she kept going. Silas tried to help, but after an hour he had to sit down, breathing hard and sweating despite the relatively cool morning. "You should rest," Evelyn said. "I should be helping." "You are helping. You're not dying. That's helpful." He actually smiled at that, a brief flash of humor in his weathered face. Fair point. By the end of the first week, Evelyn had established a routine. Mornings were for the heaviest work, repairing fences, checking on the cattle, fixing whatever had broken overnight. Afternoons were for cooking, cleaning, and the smaller tasks that kept a household running. Evenings were for collapsing into bed so exhausted she couldn't think. Silas was getting stronger, not quickly, but steadily. The color was coming back to his face, and he could work for longer periods without having to stop. Whatever infection had nearly killed him was finally loosening its grip. They didn't talk much. Silas wasn't a chatty man, and Evelyn was too tired for conversation. But there was something comfortable in the silence. Two people working side by side, no expectations, no judgments. On the 10th day, Evelyn was in the barn trying to patch a hole in the roof when she heard horses approaching. She climbed down carefully and stepped outside to find 2 men she didn't recognize dismounting in the yard. They were both in their 30s, dressed like ranch hands, with the kind of easy confidence that came from knowing they were stronger and more capable than most people they met. "Help you?" Evelyn asked. The taller one looked her up and down, not bothering to hide his assessment. "We're looking for Silas Granger." "He's resting." "We'll wait." But Silas had heard the voices and was already coming out of the house, moving slower than Evelyn would have liked. "Cal, Dutch." He nodded at the men. "What brings you out here?" "Heard you've been sick," Cal said. The way he said it made it clear he'd heard more than that. "Thought we'd check on the place, make sure everything's running smooth." "Everything's fine." "Doesn't look fine." Dutch was staring at the broken fences, the scattered cattle, the general air of neglect. "Looks like the place is falling apart." "We're working on it." Cal's eyes shifted to Evelyn. This the girl who got dumped at the station? Evelyn felt her face heat, but she kept her expression neutral. This is Miss Mercer, Silas said firmly. She's helping me get the ranch back in order. Is that right? Cal smiled, but it wasn't friendly. Well, if you need any real help, Granger, you know where to find us. We'd hate to see this place go under just because you're too proud to ask for assistance. It wasn't until they'd ridden away that Evelyn realized what had just happened. They want your land. They've wanted it for 2 years, Silas said quietly. Cal Morrison and Dutch Webb work for the Triple R Ranch, biggest spread in the territory. Their boss has been trying to buy Cross Creek since my wife died, and I keep telling him no. Why? Because this is my home. Because I built it with my own hands. Because... He stopped, looking out at the broken fences and dying fields. Because giving up feels like dying. Evelyn understood that better than he knew. That night, she pulled out Vernon Hadley's $20 and set it on the kitchen table. What's this? Silas asked. Payment for seeds, supplies, whatever the ranch needs most. That's your money. I don't need it. The ranch does. Silas stared at the bills for a long moment. Then he picked them up, counted out 10, and handed the rest back to her. We'll split it, he said. The ranch takes half. You keep half. Fair's fair. It was the first time in Evelyn's life that anyone had treated her money like it mattered, like she mattered. She took the $10 back and nodded, not trusting herself to speak. They went to town together the next week, Silas's first trip since getting sick. Evelyn felt the stares as they walked into Mrs. Patterson's store, felt the whispers starting up again. But Silas walked beside her with his head up, and when Mrs. Patterson asked if Evelyn was still interested in that store job, Silas answered before she could. Miss Mercer's working for me now, full time. The statement rippled through the store like a stone in water. Evelyn could practically hear the gossip being constructed. The crippled girl living alone with the dying rancher. Scandalous, desperate, shameful. Let them talk. She had work to do. They bought seeds, beans, squash, corn. They bought fence wire and nails. They bought a new irrigation pump because the old one was beyond repair. It took almost all of their combined money, but when they loaded everything into the wagon and headed back to Cross Creek, Evelyn felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The ranch didn't transform overnight. Progress was slow and painful and setback-prone. A dust storm tore down the fence they'd just repaired. The irrigation pump clogged within a week. 3 of the cattle were found dead from some disease neither of them could identify. But they kept working. Silas taught her how to mend fences properly, how to read the sky for weather, how to doctor sick cattle with whatever supplies they could afford. Evelyn taught herself through trial and error, planting seeds, managing water, cooking with ingredients that would have baffled her 6 months ago. And slowly, painfully, Cross Creek Ranch began to breathe again. The crops came in sparse but real. The remaining cattle stopped looking half dead. The house stopped smelling like sickness. One evening, 2 months after Evelyn had arrived, Silas came in from checking the fences and found her sitting on the porch steps, exhausted and filthy and staring at the sunset. You all right? He asked. I was supposed to be on a train heading east by now, she said quietly. Back to Missouri, back to my family, back to being the poor, crippled girl nobody wanted. Silas sat down beside her, grunting slightly as his knees protested. You regret staying? No. She surprised herself with how quickly she answered, I don't regret it at all. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun paint the desert in impossible colors. You know, Silas said eventually, I never thanked you. For what? For not giving up on this place. For not giving up on me. He paused. I was ready to die when you showed up. Sounds dramatic, but it's true. I'd stopped caring whether the ranch survived, whether I survived. And then you walked in here with your suitcase and your stubborn pride and just started working like it mattered. It does matter, Evelyn said softly. Yeah, Silas nodded. Yeah, it does. Inside, something shifted. Some invisible wall that had existed between employer and employee, between strangers thrown together by desperation. They weren't friends exactly, not yet, but they weren't alone anymore either. And for Evelyn Mercer, who'd spent so much of her life feeling invisible, that was more than enough. The first real test came in October, when the sky turned the color of old bruises and stayed that way for 3 days straight. Evelyn was in the garden, harvesting what little squash had survived the summer heat, when she felt the wind shift. It came from the north now, carrying something sharper than dust. The smell of rain, maybe, or just the promise of it. She straightened up, wiping sweat from her forehead, and saw Silas standing by the barn with his hand shading his eyes, staring at the horizon. "Storm coming?" she called out. "Worse. Dust storm." He turned toward her, his expression tight. "We need to get the cattle into the southern pasture and board up the windows. Now." They worked fast, but not fast enough. The storm hit just as they were hammering the last board across the kitchen window, and it hit hard. A wall of dust and wind that turned midday into twilight and made breathing feel like drowning. Inside the house, they could hear things breaking outside, wood splintering, metal screaming against metal. Silas sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. "The fences won't hold." "Then we'll fix them again." Evelyn was trying to sound more confident than she felt. "With what money? We're barely scraping by as it is." It was true. The harvest had been disappointing, enough to eat, not enough to sell. The cattle were healthier, but still too few to make any real profit. They'd been living off Evelyn's remaining savings and Silas's dwindling reserves, rationing everything, making every penny stretch until it screamed. The storm lasted 18 hours. When it finally passed, they stepped outside to survey the damage and found it worse than either had imagined. 2 sections of fence were completely gone, torn away like paper. The barn roof had a new hole the size of a wagon wheel. Half the garden was buried under a foot of dirt, and the cattle were scattered across the range again, undoing 2 months of work in a single night. Silas stood in the middle of the devastation and laughed, a bitter, exhausted sound that had nothing to do with humor. "You should have taken that train," he said quietly. "This place is cursed." "I don't believe in curses." "Then you're smarter than me." He turned to look at her, and for the first time since they'd met, he looked truly defeated. "I can't pay you, Evelyn. I can barely feed us. Maybe it's time to admit this was a mistake." "No." "No? We're not giving up." She said it with more conviction than she felt, but sometimes conviction was all you had. "We'll fix the fences. We'll round up the cattle. We'll make it work." "How?" That was the question, wasn't it? Evelyn thought about the $10 she still had hidden in her room. She thought about the general store and Mrs. Patterson's offer of 30 cents a day. She thought about swallowing her pride one more time. "I'll go into town tomorrow," she said. "See if Mrs. Patterson still needs help. It's not much, but it's something." Silas opened his mouth like he wanted to argue, then closed it again. They both knew they didn't have better options. The ride into Blackstone Ridge the next morning felt different than it had 2 months ago. Evelyn sat straighter in the saddle now, her hands steadier on the reins. Her legs still ached with every step the horse took, but she'd learned to distribute her weight better, to compensate in ways that made the pain manageable instead of unbearable. Mrs. Patterson was sweeping the front steps when Evelyn arrived. The older woman looked up, her expression unreadable. "Miss Mercer, haven't seen you in a while." "I've been busy." "So I heard." Mrs. Patterson leaned on her broom. "Whole town's talking about you and Silas Granger living out there alone. You know what people are saying, don't you?" "I can imagine." "And you don't care?" Evelyn met her eyes. "I care about eating. I care about keeping a roof over my head. I don't much care what people say about it." Something shifted in Mrs. Patterson's face. Respect, maybe, or at least acknowledgement. "The job's still available if you want it. Same terms as before." "I'll take it." "Good. You can start now if you're ready." So Evelyn worked. 6 days a week, sunrise to sunset, stocking shelves and sweeping floors, and dealing with customers who either ignored her completely or stared at her limp with undisguised curiosity. The 30 cents a day went straight into a coffee tin she kept hidden in her room at the ranch, and every week she watched it grow a little more. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Silas hated it. She could tell by the way his jaw tightened whenever she came home exhausted, by the way he'd already have dinner made and the evening chores done like he was trying to make up for her having to work in town. "You shouldn't have to do this," he said one night. "We both do what we have to." "It's not right. Right doesn't matter. Surviving matters." He didn't argue with that, but she could see it bothered him. The old-fashioned notion that a man should provide, that accepting help from a woman made him less somehow. Evelyn understood the feeling even if she thought it was stupid. Pride was a luxury neither of them could afford. The weeks crawled by. Evelyn worked in town during the day and helped with ranch work in the evenings and early mornings. Silas repaired fences, tracked down scattered cattle, and tried to make progress on the dozen other things that needed fixing. They were both exhausted all the time, running on coffee and stubbornness and not much else. And then, in early November, Vernon Hadley walked into the general store. Evelyn was rearranging a display of canned goods when she heard his voice at the counter asking Mrs. Patterson about an order of lumber. She kept her back turned, hoping he'd finish his business and leave without noticing her. No such luck. "Evelyn?" She turned slowly. Vernon stood there with his hat in his hands, looking uncomfortable. "I heard you were working here," he said. "Word travels fast." "I also heard you're living out at Cross Creek Ranch." "That's right." He shifted his weight, glancing around like he was checking to see who might be listening. The store was empty except for Mrs. Patterson, who had conveniently found something urgent to do in the back room. "Look," Vernon said, lowering his voice, "I know things ended badly between us, but I feel responsible for your situation. If you need help, I don't. You're working for 30 cents a day and living on a failing ranch with a sick old man. That's not a future, Evelyn. That's barely surviving. It's my choice." "Is it? Or are you just too proud to admit you made a mistake?" His expression softened, like he was trying to be kind. "Come work at my ranch. I'll pay you a fair wage, give you your own quarters. Respectable work, respectable situation. Better than what you've got now." For a moment, just a moment, Evelyn was tempted. A real wage, a secure position, no more scraping by on hope and stubbornness. It would be so much easier. But then she remembered the way Vernon had looked at her on the train platform, the disgust in his eyes when he saw her limp. She remembered him walking away without a word, remembered the envelope with its pathetic apology and its guilt money. "No, thank you," she said quietly. "Evelyn?" "I said no." Vernon's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake. Silas Granger is finished. That ranch is finished. Everyone knows it." "Then everyone can mind their own business." She turned back to the canned goods, her hands shaking slightly, but her voice steady. After a moment, she heard Vernon's footsteps retreating, heard the door open and close. Mrs. Patterson emerged from the back room. "That took guts." "That took stupidity," Evelyn corrected. "He's probably right. The ranch probably is finished." "Maybe, but at least you're going down fighting." That night, Evelyn told Silas about Vernon's offer. They were sitting on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset behind the mountains. "You should have taken it," Silas said. "I didn't want to." "Why not? He's right. You'd be better off." Evelyn was quiet for a moment, trying to put into words something she hadn't fully articulated even to herself. "Because when I was at that train station, when Vernon walked away, I felt like the most worthless thing in the world, like I wasn't good enough to deserve a future. And then I came here, and you—" She stopped, struggling. "You didn't look at me like I was broken. You looked at me like I could work, like I mattered." Silas didn't say anything right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "You do matter, and for what it's worth, I'm glad you stayed." Something warm unfurled in Evelyn's chest. Not love, not yet, but something adjacent to it, something that felt like belonging. Winter came early that year, bringing frost that killed what was left of the garden, and temperatures that made every morning feel like punishment. The cattle needed more feed, which cost money they didn't have. The house needed more firewood, which meant hours of chopping when they were already working from dawn to dusk. Evelyn's savings tin was growing, but slowly. At this rate, it would take months to save enough to buy the supplies they needed to properly repair the ranch. And they didn't have months. Winter was expensive, spring planting required seed money, and every week brought some new crisis that ate through their reserves. In December, 2 more ranch hands from the RRR showed up at Cross Creek. This time they came with an offer. Cal Morrison and Dutch Webb rode up to the house on a Saturday afternoon while Evelyn was chopping firewood and Silas was checking on the cattle. Cal dismounted with the easy confidence of someone who expected to be welcomed. "Miss Mercer," he said, tipping his hat. "Silas around?" "He's working." "We can wait." But Evelyn set down the axe and wiped her hands on her skirt. "What do you want?" "Just want to talk business. Boss sent us with an offer for Silas. A good offer." He's not selling. You sure about that? Dutch was eyeing the property with barely concealed disdain. Place looks worse every time we ride by. How much longer can he hold out? As long as it takes. Cal smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You're loyal. That's admirable. But loyalty doesn't fix broken fences or buy cattle feed. Our boss is offering top dollar for this land, enough for Silas to retire comfortable, maybe even move somewhere civilized. He should at least hear the offer. He's heard offers before. The answer is still no. Maybe you should let him speak for himself. Maybe you should get off our property. The word our slipped out before she could stop it, and she saw both men notice it. Cal's smile widened. Our property? That's interesting. You getting yourself a stake in this place, Miss Mercer? I'm helping a friend. Is that what they're calling it these days? Dutch laughed, a mean sound. Town's got some colorful theories about what you're doing out here. Heat flooded Evelyn's face, but she kept her voice level. I don't care what the town thinks. You should. Reputation matters in a place like this. And right now, yours is looking pretty rough. Cal held up a hand, cutting off his partner. Easy, Dutch. No need to be crude. He turned back to Evelyn, his expression softening into something that might have passed for sympathy. Look, we're not trying to cause trouble. We're just businessmen doing a job. Our boss wants this land, and he's willing to pay fair for it. But if Silas keeps refusing, well, there are other ways to get what you want. Is that a threat? It's a fact. This ranch is barely hanging on. One bad season, one serious problem, and it's done. Why not sell now while there's still something worth selling? Silas's voice cut through the conversation like a knife. Because I'm not interested. He was walking up from the southern pasture, his shotgun slung over one shoulder, not pointing at anyone but present enough to make a point. His face was hard. Silas, Cal's tone turned professional. We were just explaining the offer. I heard the offer. Answer's no. You're making a mistake. That's my right. Cal and Dutch exchanged a look. Then Cal shrugged and remounted his horse. Your funeral, Granger. Don't say we didn't warn you. They rode off, leaving dust and tension in their wake. You shouldn't antagonize them, Silas said quietly once they were gone. They antagonized first. Evelyn, I know they're dangerous. I know they could make things harder for us, but I'm not going to stand here and let them talk about you like you're already dead. Silas looked at her for a long moment, something complicated crossing his face. Then he nodded. All right, but we need to be careful. Men like that don't like being told no. He was right to worry. 3 days later, Evelyn rode into town for her shift at the general store and found the door locked. Mrs. Patterson was waiting outside with her arms crossed. I'm sorry, Evelyn. I can't employ you anymore. What? Why? Mrs. Patterson looked genuinely regretful. Had a visit from some men yesterday. They made it clear that if I keep you on, I'll lose their business. And they represent a lot of business, ranch supplies, bulk orders, regular custom. I can't afford to lose that. Let me guess, Triple R Ranch. I didn't ask their names. You didn't have to. Evelyn felt something cold settle in her stomach. This is about Silas refusing to sell. I don't know what it's about. I just know I can't afford to get caught in the middle. Mrs. Patterson pulled out a small envelope. This is what I owe you for the week, plus a little extra. I truly am sorry. Evelyn took the envelope because refusing it would accomplish nothing. So am I. She rode back to Cross Creek with her jaw clenched and her mind racing. Losing the store job meant losing their only reliable income. It meant their savings would run dry faster. It meant they were more vulnerable than ever. When she told Silas, he took it worse than she'd expected. This is my fault, he said. They're going after you to get to me. It's not your fault they're bastards. Maybe I should just sell, cut my losses, take whatever they're offering. No. The word came out sharper than she'd intended. You work too hard for this place. You don't give it up because some rich rancher wants to expand his empire. And what do we live on while we fight them? Pride doesn't buy cattle feed. We'll figure something out. How? He wasn't being cruel, just honest. How do we survive when they can cut off every opportunity we have? Evelyn didn't have an answer. Not yet. That night she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind turning over possibilities. They could try selling their cattle, But the herd was too small to fetch a good price. They could try selling crops, but they'd barely grown enough to feed themselves. They could try taking out a loan, but who would lend money to a failing ranch? The only asset they had was the land itself, and that was exactly what the Triple R wanted. She must have dozed off eventually because she woke to the smell of smoke. For a confused moment, she thought it was morning, and Silas had started the kitchen fire. Then she heard shouting and the terrified lowing of cattle and realized it was the middle of the night and something was very, very wrong. Evelyn grabbed her shawl and ran outside in her nightgown. The barn was on fire. Not the whole barn, just one corner where the hay was stored. But fire in a barn full of dry hay and wooden beams was essentially a death sentence. Already the flames were spreading, licking up the walls, filling the air with smoke and heat. Silas was already there, throwing buckets of water that did almost nothing against the growing inferno. Evelyn ran to help, her bare feet stumbling over rough ground, her bad legs screaming in protest. They worked frantically, hauling water from the trough, throwing it on flames that seemed to mock their efforts. The cattle in the nearby pen were panicking, crashing against the fence. Evelyn ran to open the gate, letting them scatter into the darkness. Better loose than burned alive. It took an hour to get the fire under control, and by then half the barn was destroyed. They stood in the wreckage, covered in ash and sweat and exhaustion, staring at the damage. This wasn't an accident, Silas said quietly. Evelyn had been thinking the same thing. The fire had started in a corner where they kept nothing that could spontaneously combust. And earlier that evening, she'd thought she heard horses in the distance, though she'd convinced herself it was nothing. "Can you prove it?" she asked. "No." "Then it doesn't matter." But it did matter. It mattered that someone had tried to burn them out. It mattered that they were vulnerable and exposed and running out of options. In the morning, they assessed the damage in the harsh light of day. The barn would need to be rebuilt, money they didn't have. The hay they'd stored for winter feed was mostly destroyed, supplies they couldn't replace. The cattle they'd let loose during the fire were scattered across the range again, weeks of work undone. And through it all, the Triple R Ranch loomed in the background like a patient predator, waiting for them to collapse. "I'm riding into town," Silas said, "going to talk to the sheriff." "And tell him what? That we think someone set a fire but we have no proof?" "I have to try." He came back 3 hours later with defeat written across his face. The sheriff had been sympathetic but useless. Without evidence, there was nothing he could do. And even if there had been evidence, going up against the biggest ranch in the territory wasn't something a small-town sheriff was equipped to handle. They were on their own. That night, Evelyn pulled out her savings tin and counted the money inside. $43, the result of months of work, of saving every penny, of going without. It wouldn't rebuild the barn. It wouldn't replace the lost hay. But it might buy them a little more time. She brought it to Silas. "What's this?" he asked. "Everything I've saved. It's not much, but no." He pushed it back toward her. "That's your money. You earned it. We need it for the ranch. You need it for yourself, for when this place finally goes under and you have to start over somewhere else." "I'm not planning on starting over somewhere else." "Evelyn, take the money, Silas, please." They stared at each other across the kitchen table, the tin of bills sitting between them like a challenge. Finally, Silas picked it up, counted out half, and handed the rest back to her. "We split it," he said, "like we did before. Fair's fair." It wasn't enough. They both knew it. But it was something, and something was better than nothing. December turned into January and the winter deepened. They used Evelyn's money to buy hay and basic supplies, rationing everything, making hard choices about what they could afford to keep and what they had to let go. 3 more cattle died from the cold. The vegetable garden was a frozen wasteland. Every morning brought some new problem that needed solving with resources they didn't have. Evelyn stopped going into town entirely. After losing the store job, there didn't seem to be much point, and besides, she couldn't stand the stares and whispers. The few times Silas went in for supplies, he came back with stories about what people were saying, that Evelyn was Silas's mistress, that she was taking advantage of a sick old man, that the whole situation was shameful and improper. "They can think whatever they want," Evelyn said, but it bothered her more than she wanted to admit. What bothered her even more was the growing certainty that they were fighting a losing battle. Every day was a struggle just to maintain what they had, let alone make progress. The ranch wasn't dying quickly, but it was dying steadily, worn down by winter and sabotage and simple economics. One night in late January, Silas sat her down at the kitchen table with a serious expression. "We need to talk," he said. "That's never good." "I've been thinking about selling." Evelyn's stomach dropped. "You said—" "I know what I said, but I can't keep doing this to you. You've given up everything to help me, and for what? A ranch that's circling the drain and a reputation that's ruined. You deserve better." "I deserve to make my own choices. And I'm giving you one. If you want to leave, if you want to take what money we have left and start fresh somewhere else, I won't stop you. I'll even help you. But I can't keep watching you sacrifice yourself for a lost cause." "It's not a lost cause, isn't it?" His voice was gentle but firm. "Look around, Evelyn. We're barely surviving. One more disaster and we're done. Maybe it's time to admit defeat." Evelyn looked at him, really looked at him. Silas had gained weight since she'd arrived. His color was better. He moved without the careful fragility of someone expecting to collapse at any moment. The ranch had saved him as much as he'd saved her. "If you sell," she said slowly, "what happens to you? I'll figure something out." "That's not an answer." He smiled sadly. "It's the only answer I've got." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of impossible choices pressing down on both of them. Finally, Evelyn stood up. "I'm not leaving," she said. "And you're not selling, not yet. We've made it this far. We can make it a little further." "How?" "I don't know, but we'll figure it out." It was foolish optimism, stubborn pride dressed up as hope. But sometimes that's all you had to work with. The answer came from an unexpected source 2 weeks later, when a stranger rode up to Cross Creek Ranch on a gray mare, looking for Silas Granger. The stranger was a woman, maybe 40, dressed in practical riding clothes, with sharp eyes and the kind of confidence that came from making your own way in the world. Evelyn watched from the garden as she dismounted and approached Silas by the barn. "Mr. Granger, my name's Margaret Stone. I'm a cattle buyer out of Tucson, and I heard you might have some stock to sell." Silas looked surprised. "Where'd you hear that?" "Word travels. I'm always looking for good breeding stock, and I heard Cross Creek used to have some of the best in the territory." "Used to is right. Most of what I've got now isn't worth much." Margaret smiled. "Mind if I take a look anyway?" What followed was an hour of Margaret examining their remaining cattle with the practiced eye of someone who knew quality when she saw it. Finally, she came back to where Silas and Evelyn were waiting. "You've got 3 head that interest me," she said. 2 heifers and a bull. Good bone structure, healthy despite the hard winter. I'll give you $60 for all 3. $60. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more cash than they'd seen in months. "Those are some of our best," Silas said carefully. "I know. That's why I'm offering good money for them. We were hoping to use them to rebuild the herd. And you can, with the money I'm paying you, buy younger stock, build back up." Margaret's expression was businesslike, but not unkind. "Look, I'm not trying to take advantage. I'm offering fair market value. But if you'd rather keep them, that's your choice." Silas looked at Evelyn. She gave a small nod. They needed the money more than they needed 3 cattle they could barely feed anyway. "All right," Silas said, you've got a deal." Margaret paid in cash on the spot and arranged to have the cattle picked up within the week. After she left, Silas and Evelyn stood in the yard staring at the money like it might disappear if they looked away. "That's enough to get us through to spring," Evelyn said quietly. "Maybe." Silas's expression was cautious. "If nothing else goes wrong." But for the first time in weeks, maybe felt like enough. Of course, something else went wrong. They should have expected it. The $60 for Margaret Stone felt like a lifeline, and maybe that's why they let their guard down for exactly 3 days before the next disaster hit. Evelyn was in the kitchen making breakfast when she heard Silas shouting from outside. Not angry shouting, but the kind of yelling that meant something had gone catastrophically wrong. She limped out as fast as her leg would allow and found him standing by the well, staring down into the darkness with an expression that made her stomach drop. "What is it?" "Well's contaminated." He turned to her, his face tight. "Something died down there. Can smell it." Evelyn peered over the edge and caught the faint but unmistakable stench of rotting flesh mixed with standing water. Her mind immediately went to the most paranoid explanation: sabotage, the Triple R, more attempts to drive them off the land. Could someone have... Doesn't matter if they did or didn't. Silas's voice was flat. Results the same. We can't drink this water, can't use it for cooking, can't even give it to the animals without risking them getting sick. How long to clean it out? Days? Maybe a week? Have to drain it, pull out whatever's down there, scrub the whole thing, let it refill. He rubbed his face with both hands. And we'll need water to live on in the meantime. The nearest clean water source was a creek about 4 miles north, doable on horseback, but carrying enough water back for 2 people, and the remaining livestock would mean constant trips back and forth. It would eat up hours they couldn't afford to lose, energy they were already running short on. Evelyn did the math in her head. How much would it cost to have water hauled out from town? More than we should spend. Silas looked at her. But probably less than killing ourselves trying to haul it by hand. They ended up compromising. Silas hired a water wagon to bring out 1 delivery, enough to get them through the first few days, while he worked on draining and cleaning the well. The wagon cost them $8, a significant chunk of Margaret Stone's $60, but it bought them time. The work was miserable. Silas spent 3 days down in that well, hauling up buckets of foul water and debris, his clothes soaked and reeking. Evelyn helped as much as she could, operating the rope and pulley system, dumping buckets, trying not to breathe too deeply when the wind shifted. On the second day, Silas pulled up the source of the contamination, a dead coyote, bloated and decomposing, that must have fallen in weeks ago. How it had gotten past the well cover was anyone's guess, but Evelyn had her suspicions. The cover had been slightly askew when they'd first noticed the problem, like someone had moved it and not quite put it back right. She didn't share this theory with Silas. He was already operating on the edge of his endurance, and paranoia wouldn't help either of them. By the time the well was clean and refilling, another week had passed and their water delivery was running low. Silas made the 4-mile trip to the creek twice a day, coming back exhausted with barely enough water to meet their basic needs. Evelyn watched him push himself harder than he should, saw the way his hand shook when he thought she wasn't looking, and worried that they were asking too much of a body that had nearly died 6 months ago. "You need to rest," she said one evening after he'd stumbled in from the second water run, barely able to stand. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're running yourself into the ground. What choice do I have?" He collapsed into a chair at the kitchen table. "Someone's got to keep us alive." "Then let me help more. I can make the water runs." "On that leg? 4 miles each way over rough ground?" He shook his head. "No. I've done harder things. I know you have, but I'm asking you not to." His voice softened. "Please, Evelyn, let me do this." She wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she was just as capable, but the exhaustion in his face stopped her. Sometimes letting someone help you was its own kind of strength. The well refilled slowly over the next week, and life at Cross Creek settled back into its new normal, which was to say, barely controlled chaos held together by stubbornness and prayer, though Evelyn would never have admitted to the praying part. February brought a brief warm spell that tricked them into thinking winter might be ending early. The snow melted, the ground thawed, and for a few precious days it almost felt like they might make it through to spring after all. Then the warm spell broke, temperatures plummeted overnight, and everything that had melted froze solid. The result was ice. Everywhere, coating every surface, turning the ranch into a skating rink where every step was a potential disaster. Evelyn slipped twice in the first hour of morning chores, her bad leg unable to compensate for the treacherous footing. The second fall was bad enough that she lay there for a moment, pain shooting up her spine, wondering if she'd finally pushed too hard. Silas found her there and helped her up without comment, but his face was grim. "Stay inside," he said. "I can work." "Not on this ice you can't. I don't need you breaking your neck because you're too stubborn to admit when something's dangerous." For once, she didn't argue. Her leg was throbbing, her hip ached where she'd landed, and she could feel something pulled in her lower back that would probably hurt worse tomorrow. She retreated to the kitchen and tried to make herself useful in ways that didn't require walking on ice. The freeze lasted 3 days. 3 days of Silas doing all the outside work alone, of watching him move carefully across the ice-slicked yard, of holding her breath every time he climbed a ladder or got near the animals. 3 days of feeling useless and frustrated and angry at her own body for being such a liability. On the third evening, she was standing at the kitchen window when she saw him fall. It happened fast. One moment he was walking toward the barn. The next his feet went out from under him and he went down hard, his head bouncing off the frozen ground with a sound that made her stomach turn. Evelyn was out the door before she'd even thought about it. Ice be damned. She half ran, half slid across the yard and dropped to her knees beside him. Silas, Silas, can you hear me? He groaned, which was good, meant he was conscious. But when he tried to sit up, his face went white and he gasped in pain. My shoulder, he managed. Something's wrong. His left shoulder was already starting to swell, sitting at an angle that didn't look right. Dislocated maybe, or broken. Either way, he needed help that Evelyn couldn't provide. Getting him into the house took 20 minutes and left them both shaking with exhaustion and pain. Evelyn half dragged, half supported him across the ice, her bad legs screaming with every step, Silas's weight making her hips scream louder. By the time they made it inside, she was crying from the effort, and he looked like he might pass out. She got him into a chair and examined the shoulder as gently as she could. Definitely dislocated. She could see where the joint had separated, could see the unnatural shape under his shirt. I need to set it, she said. You know how to do that? I've seen it done. Once, when she was 14, she'd watched the town doctor relocate her uncle's shoulder after a farming accident. She'd been fascinated by the process, by the precise combination of angle and force required. Now she wished she'd paid closer attention. This is going to hurt, she warned. Everything hurts already. Just do it. Evelyn positioned herself carefully, braced Silas's arm at the right angle, and pulled. He made a sound somewhere between a shout and a scream, and for a horrible moment nothing happened. Then she felt the joint pop back into place with a sensation that made her nauseous. Silas slumped in the chair, breathing hard, sweat pouring down his face despite the cold. Is it in? He asked. I think so. You think so? It's back where it's supposed to be. That's all I know. She fashioned a sling from a torn sheet and made him promise to keep his arm immobilized for at least a week. He promised, though they both knew a week was a luxury they couldn't afford. The ranch didn't stop needing work just because the owner was injured. That night, Evelyn lay in bed listening to Silas move restlessly in the next room, probably in too much pain to sleep. She stared at the ceiling and did calculations in her head. How much money they had left, how much they needed to make it to spring, how many more disasters they could survive before the whole operation collapsed completely. The numbers didn't add up. They never added up. In the morning, despite his injured shoulder, Silas tried to do his usual chores. Evelyn stopped him at the door. You're not going out there. The animals need feeding. I'll feed them. Evelyn, your shoulder needs time to heal. If you tear something or dislocate it again, you could do permanent damage. Then where will we be? He wanted to argue. She could see it in his face, but he also knew she was right. Reluctantly, he sat back down at the kitchen table. Be careful on the ice, he said quietly. Evelyn nodded and headed outside. The work took her twice as long as it should have. Her leg protested every movement on the slippery ground, and tasks that would have been simple for Silas required creative problem-solving for someone with her limitations. Carrying water buckets was a nightmare. She could only manage one at a time, which meant twice as many trips. Throwing hay to the cattle left her gasping with effort. By the time she finished the morning chores, it was nearly noon and she was exhausted. She came inside to find Silas had made lunch. One-handed, awkwardly, but he'd managed. You should be resting, she said. So should you. They ate in silence, too tired for conversation. Evelyn's leg was throbbing badly enough that she could feel the pain in her teeth. Silas's shoulder must have hurt worse, but he didn't complain. After lunch, she forced herself back outside for the afternoon chores. The ice was starting to melt in the weak February sun, which should have made things easier, but somehow made them worse. Now, instead of solid ice, there was slush and mud and unpredictable patches of both. She was hauling firewood when she heard riders approaching. 3 men this time. Cal Morrison and Dutch Webb from the Triple R, plus a third man she didn't recognize, older, well-dressed, sitting his horse with the casual authority of someone who owned things and expected them to do what he wanted. Evelyn set down the firewood and waited. Miss Mercer, Cal said, touching his hat brim. Is Silas available? He's resting. We'd like to speak with him. About what? The older man nudged his horse forward. I'm Richard Thornton. I own the Triple R. and I'm here to make Mr. Granger an offer he should seriously consider. He's already told you no. Circumstances change. Thornton's eyes swept over the ranch, the damaged barn, the sparse cattle, the general air of barely hanging on. I'm prepared to offer $1,500 for this property. That's more than fair for land in this condition. $1,500. It was more money than Evelyn had ever seen in her life. Enough to buy a new start somewhere else. Enough to live on for years if you were careful. But it wasn't hers to sell. I'll pass along your offer, she said. You do that. Thornton started to turn his horse, then paused. And Miss Mercer? I'd advise you to encourage Mr. Granger to accept. This ranch is dying. You're both suffering for nothing. Take the money and start fresh somewhere else. We're not suffering, Dutch laughed. You're standing there covered in mud and barely able to walk, working yourself to death for a place that'll be bankrupt by summer. If that's not suffering, I don't know what is. Evelyn felt her face heat. Get off our property. Gladly, Thornton said, but the offer stands. Think about it. They rode off, and Evelyn stood there shaking, with anger, with exhaustion, with the horrible knowledge that Dutch was right. They were suffering. They were working themselves to death. And for what? She found Silas at the kitchen window, having watched the whole exchange. $1,500, he said quietly. You going to take it? Should I? Evelyn sat down heavily in a chair, her leg finally giving out. I don't know anymore. Maybe they're right. Maybe we're just being stubborn. Is that what you really think? She was quiet for a long time, trying to find an honest answer. No, she said finally. I think we're fighting for something that matters. I just don't know if we're strong enough to win. We've made it this far. Barely. Barely's better than not at all. He was right, but it didn't make her feel better. That night, Evelyn pulled out their remaining money and counted it again. $42 left from the cattle sale after paying for water delivery and supplies and medicine for Silas's shoulder. $42 to get them through the rest of winter and into spring planting season. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. She was still sitting at the table, staring at the money, when Silas came in. Can't sleep? He asked. Can't stop doing math. He sat down across from her. What if we took Thornton's offer? Evelyn looked up, surprised. You want to sell? I want you to stop killing yourself for my stubborn pride. His voice was tired. $1,500, Evelyn. We could both start over. You could go somewhere with doctors who could help your leg, somewhere you wouldn't have to work like a dog just to survive. I don't know what I'd do, but it'd be something easier than this. You love this ranch. I loved my wife too, and she still died. Love doesn't make things last. It was the most defeated she'd ever heard him sound, and it scared her more than the money problems, more than the sabotage, more than any of it. Don't, she said. Don't give up. Not now. What's the point of not giving up? Because, she struggled for words. Because I came here with nothing. I was nothing. Just some crippled woman nobody wanted. And you gave me a chance to be something more. You gave me a chance to matter. If we sell, if we give up, what was it all for? Silas's expression softened. You mattered before you came here. You matter now. That doesn't change whether we own this ranch or not. It does to me. They sat in silence for a while, the oil lamp flickering between them. All right, Silas said finally. We keep fighting, but if things get worse, if we run out of money, if one of us gets seriously hurt, we revisit this conversation. Deal? Deal. They shook hands across the table, sealing a pact that was probably foolish but felt necessary anyway. March came in cold and mean. Silas's shoulder healed slowly, too slowly, and he couldn't do half the work he'd normally manage. Evelyn picked up the slack, pushing herself harder than she should, ignoring her body's increasingly frantic protests. Her legs swelled some nights so badly she could barely get her boot off. Her back ached constantly. She lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. But the ranch kept running, barely, desperately, but running. Then, on a cold morning in mid-March, something changed. Evelyn was checking the cattle when she noticed one of the heifers was acting strange, pacing, restless, showing signs of distress. She called Silas over, and together they watched the animal for a few minutes before Silas started grinning. She's in labor, he said. Is that good? It's the first calf we'll have had in over a year. Yes, it's good. They moved the heifer into the barn and prepared for what they hoped would be a normal birth. Instead, it turned into a 12-hour ordeal of complications and close calls that left them both exhausted and terrified. The calf was positioned wrong, the heifer was struggling, and for a while it looked like they might lose both animals. But Silas had delivered difficult calves before, and with Evelyn's help, he managed to turn the calf and guide it out. When the wet, trembling creature finally emerged and took its first shaky breath, Evelyn felt something break open in her chest. Relief and joy, and something bigger that she didn't have words for. "We did it," she whispered. Silas was grinning like a fool, covered in blood and fluid and sweat. "We did." The calf, a female, which meant they could eventually build the herd back up, stood on wobbly legs within an hour. The mother was exhausted but healthy, and for the first time in months, something on Cross Creek Ranch had gone right. That night, they celebrated with the last of their coffee and stale bread, and it felt like a feast. "One calf doesn't solve our problems," Silas said, but he was still smiling. "No, but it's a start." They were still discussing plans for the spring when someone knocked on the door. It was late, past 9, and visitors at this hour meant trouble. Silas grabbed his rifle before answering, Evelyn close behind him. Vernon Hadley stood on the porch, alone, looking uncomfortable. "I need to talk to you both," he said without preamble. Silas didn't lower the rifle. "About what?" "About Richard Thornton and what he's planning." Vernon glanced past them into the house. "Can I come in? This isn't a conversation for the porch." Silas and Evelyn exchanged a glance. Then, reluctantly, Silas stepped aside. Vernon sat at the kitchen table, turning his hat in his hands. In the lamplight, he looked older than Evelyn remembered, or maybe just tired. "Thornton sent me," he said. "He wants me to convince you to sell. Says I'm friendly with you, that you might listen to me." "We're not friendly," Evelyn said coldly. "I know. That's why I'm here anyway." Vernon took a breath. "I'm not trying to convince you to sell. I'm trying to warn you. Thornton's done playing games. If you don't accept his next offer, he's going to make your lives hell. More than he already has." "How much worse can it get?" Silas asked. "A lot worse. The barn fire, the well contamination, that was amateur hour. He's got connections in town, can make sure nobody sells you supplies. Nobody trades with you, nobody helps you in any way. He can have your cattle impounded on false rustling charges. He can tie you up in legal battles you can't afford to fight." "Why are you telling us this?" Evelyn asked. Vernon looked at her directly for the first time since walking in. "Because I owe you. What I did, leaving you at that station, that was wrong. I've felt sick about it for months. This doesn't make up for it, but maybe it's something." "You could just refuse to help him," Silas pointed out. "I could, but I work for him. My ranch is mortgaged to his bank. If I cross him, I lose everything." Vernon's voice was hollow. "I'm not brave like you two. I'm just trying to survive." There was a long silence. "What's he offering now?" Silas asked. 2,000, final offer. You've got until the end of the month to accept." $2,000, 500 more than before. Enough to really start over, to build something new somewhere else. Evelyn felt the temptation pulling at her, whispering that maybe this was the smart choice, the sensible choice. "We'll think about it," Silas said. Vernon nodded and stood to leave. At the door, he paused and looked back at Evelyn. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I was wrong about you. You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for." After he left, Evelyn and Silas sat in silence for a long time. $2,000, Silas said finally. "I know. We could take it, walk away from all this. We could. But you don't want to." Evelyn thought about the calf born earlier that day, thought about the garden she'd planned for spring, thought about the way this broken-down ranch had given her something she'd never had before, a sense of purpose, of mattering. "No," she said. "I don't want to." Silas smiled, tired but genuine. "Me neither. Even if it gets worse?" "Even then." It was foolish and reckless and probably doomed to fail. But sitting there in that drafty kitchen with the oil lamp burning low and the wind rattling the windows, Evelyn felt something she hadn't felt since stepping off that train 6 months ago. She felt like she was exactly where she belonged. Vernon's warning proved accurate within the week. Evelyn rode into Blackstone Ridge on a Tuesday morning to buy seed for spring planting. What little money they had left folded carefully in her pocket. The general store was her first stop. Mrs. Patterson might not employ her anymore, but she'd always been fair about selling supplies. Except this time, when Evelyn walked through the door, Mrs. Patterson's expression went carefully blank. "I need seed," Evelyn said. "Corn, beans, squash, if you have it." "I'm sorry. I can't sell to you." The words hit like a physical blow. "What?" "I've been instructed not to do business with Cross Creek Ranch." Mrs. Patterson's voice was quiet, apologetic, but firm. "I don't have a choice in this." "Instructed by who?" But Evelyn already knew the answer. Mrs. Patterson didn't need to say Richard Thornton's name for it to hang in the air between them. "There are other stores," Evelyn said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Not in Blackstone Ridge, there aren't. And I'd wager you'll find the same answer anywhere within 50 miles. Mrs. Patterson leaned across the counter, lowering her voice. "I'm sorry, truly, but some of us can't afford to make enemies of powerful men." Evelyn left without another word. She tried the feed store next, then the hardware shop, then the small trading post on the edge of town. The answer was the same everywhere. Polite refusals, apologetic but absolute. No one would sell to Cross Creek Ranch. She was standing in the street, trying to figure out her next move, when she heard familiar laughter from the saloon. Through the window, she could see Vernon Hadley sitting with Cal Morrison and Dutch Webb, drinks in hand, looking relaxed and friendly. So much for owing her anything. The ride back to the ranch felt longer than usual. Evelyn's mind churned through possibilities, each one bleaker than the last. Without seed, they couldn't plant crops. Without crops, they had no food for themselves or the animals. Without food, everything collapsed. Silas took the news better than she'd expected, which somehow made it worse. "Figured it was coming," he said. "Thornton's not subtle when he wants something. We need seed. We need supplies. How are we supposed to—" "There's a town called Copper Springs about 60 miles east, bigger than Blackstone Ridge outside Thornton's immediate influence. We could try there." 60 miles, 3 days of hard riding, maybe 4 with her leg, and no guarantee that Thornton's reach didn't extend that far. "We don't have much choice," Evelyn said. "No, we don't." They left 2 days later, taking both horses and most of their remaining money. Silas's shoulder was still weak, and Evelyn's leg protested every mile, but they pushed through. The land between Blackstone Ridge and Copper Springs was rough country, desert scrub and rocky hills, with precious little water and even less shade. They made camp the first night beside a dried creek bed, eating cold beans and stale bread because they couldn't risk a fire that might attract attention. Evelyn's hip ached so badly she could barely sit down, and when she finally did, getting back up felt impossible. Silas watched her struggle for a moment, then spoke quietly. "You don't have to prove anything, you know." "I'm not trying to prove anything. Aren't you?" He poked at the cold beans with his fork. "Every time your leg hurts, every time something's hard, you push through it like you've got something to prove. Like if you show weakness, someone's going to— what? Send you away?" Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. "When I was 15, she said finally, my father told me I'd never be worth marrying. Said no man wanted a wife who couldn't dance, couldn't walk right, couldn't give him sons without likely dying in childbirth. Your father was an ass." "Maybe, but he wasn't wrong, was he?" Vernon took one look at my leg and walked away. "Everyone in Blackstone Ridge looks at me and sees something broken." "I don't." "You needed help. That's different than wanting someone around." Silas set down his fork. "Is that what you think? That I keep you here because I need you? Don't you?" "At first, maybe, but that changed months ago." He met her eyes across the small fire they'd risked after all. "You're the most stubborn, capable person I've ever met. You see a problem and you figure out how to fix it. You don't quit when things get hard. And you make me want to be better than I am, want to be worthy of someone who fights that hard for something." Evelyn felt her throat tighten. "Silas, I'm not good with words, never have been. But I need you to know you're not here because I need help. You're here because I want you here. There's a difference." They didn't talk much after that, but something had shifted between them. Something that had been building for months finally acknowledged. Evelyn lay in her bedroll that night, staring at the stars and trying to name the feeling in her chest. It wasn't love, not quite, but it was close enough to make her nervous. Copper Springs turns out to be a rougher town than Blackstone Ridge. Bigger, but meaner. The kind of place where people minded their own business because poking into other people's affairs could get you stabbed. The general store was run by a hard-eyed woman who looked at their money before she looked at their faces. "Seed, tools, whatever supplies you've got," Silas said. The woman counted their cash. "This'll get you some seed and basic tools, not much else." "That's fine." They loaded up their saddlebags with corn seed, bean seed, a few essential tools they couldn't make do without. It cleaned out most of their money, but they had what they needed to plant. It would have to be enough. On the way out of town, they passed a notice board covered in handbills and wanted posters. One caught Evelyn's eye, an advertisement for ranch workers, decent pay, room and board included. She stopped to read it, doing calculations in her head. Silas noticed her looking. "Don't even think about it." "We need money." "Not like that. I'm not sending you off to work someone else's ranch while I stay home. It's just for a season. Spring and summer, help with calving and branding and whatever else they need. Come fall, I'd have enough saved to push all—" "No." His voice was firm. "We stick together. That's the deal." Evelyn wanted to argue, wanted to point out that they couldn't survive on stubbornness alone. But the set of Silas's jaw told her this wasn't a debate she'd win, so she let it drop. The ride back to Cross Creek took 4 days instead of 3. Evelyn's leg gave out completely on the second day, pain shooting up into her hip so badly she had to stop and rest every hour. Silas never complained about the slower pace, just adjusted without comment and made sure she had water and shade when she needed it. They arrived home to find 3 of their chickens dead in the coop, their necks wrung, the bodies left where they'd fallen. Not taken for food, not killed by a predator, just murdered and abandoned as a message. Silas stood over the dead birds with his fists clenched. "They were here, on our property, while we were gone. We don't know that for sure. Don't we?" He looked at her. "Who else would do this?" Evelyn didn't have an answer. They buried the chickens and reinforced the coop, but the violation lingered. Someone had been here, in their space, touching their things. The ranch didn't feel safe anymore. Spring planting began the next week despite everything. Silas broke ground in the fields while Evelyn handled the seed, her hands remembering the rhythm from last year. Make a hole, drop seed, cover it, move on. The work was meditative in its repetition, and for a few hours each day she could almost forget about Thornton and his pressure campaign. The corn went in first, then the beans, then what little squash seed they'd managed to buy. It wasn't enough to feed them through the year, but it was better than nothing. They'd supplement with whatever cattle they could sell come fall, assuming the herd survived until then. 2 weeks into planting, a dust-covered rider appeared at the ranch. Evelyn was in the garden and didn't recognize him until he dismounted. Tom Bailey, the young ranch hand who'd delivered Vernon's rejection letter all those months ago. "Miss Mercer." He pulled off his hat nervously. "Is Mr. Granger around?" "In the north field. What do you want?" "I need to talk to both of you. It's important." Evelyn fetched Silas, and they met Tom in the yard. The kid looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Mr. Hadley sent me," he began. "We're not interested in anything Vernon has to say," Evelyn cut him off. "It's not from him exactly. Look, can I just tell you what I came to say?" Silas nodded. "Go ahead." Tom took a breath. "There's going to be trouble at the Founders Festival next month. Mr. Thornton's planning something. I don't know what exactly, but I heard him and Mr. Hadley talking. Something about making an example, about showing the whole town what happens when people don't cooperate." "Why are you telling us this?" Silas asked. "Because it's wrong." Tom's voice cracked slightly. "What they're doing to you, all of it, it's wrong. I know I'm just a ranch hand. I know I don't matter much, but I couldn't just stand by and not warn you." Evelyn studied the young man's face. He couldn't be more than 21, still had that earnest quality that life hadn't beaten out of him yet. "What exactly did you hear?" she asked. "Not much. Just that the festival would be the perfect opportunity. Lots of people, lots of witnesses. Mr. Thornton said something about public pressure, about making sure nobody in the territory would risk helping you after what he's going to do." "But he didn't say what he's going to do?" "No, ma'am. I'm sorry." Silas and Evelyn exchanged a look. The Founders Festival was Blackstone Ridge's biggest event, a full day of celebrations, competitions, trading, and socializing. The whole territory showed up. Whatever Thornton was planning, he wanted an audience. "Thank you for warning us," Silas said. Tom nodded and turned to leave, then paused. "Miss Mercer? I'm sorry. About last year, about delivering that letter. I should have said something then. You were doing your job. Still feels like I should have done something different." After he left, Evelyn and Silas sat on the porch and tried to figure out what Thornton might be planning. "Could be anything," Silas said. "Public accusation of cattle theft, maybe. Or challenging the legitimacy of my land claim. He's got lawyers who could probably manufacture some legal pretext. Or he could just make up lies. Say I'm your mistress. Say the ranch is a den of immorality. Turn the town against us through scandal. Would work. People love a scandal. So what do we do? Not go? That's probably what he wants. For us to hide out here like we're ashamed. Make us look guilty without him having to do anything." Silas rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "No, we go. We show up, hold our heads high, and deal with whatever he throws at us." "That's a terrible plan. You have a better one?" Evelyn didn't. So they kept working, kept planting, kept maintaining the ranch as best they could, while the calendar crept closer to the Founders Festival and the unknown threat waiting there. The crops started coming up in late April, tiny green shoots pushing through the soil, fragile but persistent. Evelyn checked them obsessively, looking for signs of blight or disease or any of the thousand things that could go wrong. But the plants grew, slow but steady, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something like hope. Then the cattle started disappearing. Not all at once. That would have been too obvious. Instead, it was gradual, one or two animals missing every few days. At first, Silas thought they'd just wandered off, but after a week of searching and finding nothing, the pattern became clear. Someone was stealing their cattle. "We can't prove it," Silas said after spending another fruitless day searching the range. "We both know who's doing it." Knowing and proving are different things. They were down to 11 head of cattle now from the 18 they'd started the year with. Each loss was a financial blow they couldn't afford, but more than that, it felt personal. Like Thornton was slowly dismantling their lives piece by piece, daring them to do something about it. Evelyn started sleeping lighter, waking at every sound, wondering if tonight would be the night someone came for the rest of the herd. Silas took to keeping his rifle closer, his expression growing grimmer with each passing day. The week before the Founders Festival, Vernon showed up again. This time, he looked worse than before. Tired, maybe even scared. "You need to sell," he said without preamble. "I'm serious. Thornton's done playing games." "What's he planning?" Silas asked. "I can't tell you that, but please, take the money and leave. $2,000 is more than fair." "It's not about the money," Evelyn said. "It's about not letting bullies win." Vernon laughed, a bitter sound. "You think you're in some kind of righteous battle. You're not. You're just two people trying to hold on to something that's already lost. There's no honor in that, just stubbornness." "Then we're stubborn," Silas said. "Now get off my property." After Vernon left, Evelyn felt the weight of what they were facing settle more heavily on her shoulders. Vernon was right about one thing. They were just two people. Two tired, injured, nearly broke people going up against a man with money, power, and the patience to destroy them slowly. "Maybe we should sell," she said quietly. Silas looked at her in surprise. "You serious?" "I don't know, what if we're wrong? What if we're holding on out of pride and it gets us killed? Do you really believe that?" Evelyn thought about the crops growing in the field, about the calf born in March, about the way this broken ranch had given her something she'd never had, a place to belong. She thought about walking away and what that would cost. Not in money, but in something harder to name. "No," she said finally. "I don't believe that." "Then we keep fighting." The Founders Festival dawned clear and hot. Evelyn put on her best dress, the same one she'd worn off the train almost a year ago, and tried not to think about what might happen. Silas wore his good shirt and jacket, the one he saved for special occasions, and they rode into Blackstone Ridge together like they were heading to a party instead of walking into a trap. The town square was packed with people, ranchers and farmers, merchants and miners, families with children running between the stalls selling food and trinkets. Music played somewhere, fiddles and guitars mixing with laughter and conversation. Under different circumstances, it would have been pleasant. Evelyn felt eyes on them the moment they arrived. Conversations paused, heads turned, whispers started. She kept her chin up and her expression neutral, but her stomach was churning. They made their way through the crowd, stopping to look at the various booths and displays. A few people nodded politely. Most ignored them. Nobody spoke to them directly. Then Vernon Hadley materialized out of the crowd, his face flushed with drink or anger or both. "Well, look who decided to show up," he said loudly enough to draw attention. The cripple and the dying rancher. "How's that working out for you?" Evelyn felt Silas tense beside her. "We're fine, Vernon. Thank you for asking." "Are you?" Vernon moved closer, his voice carrying across the square. "Because from where I'm standing, you look like two people who don't know when to quit, who are too proud to admit they've lost." "We haven't lost anything," Evelyn said. "Haven't you? You're broke, your ranch is falling apart, and you're living in sin out there pretending you're respectable." Vernon was playing to the crowd now, his voice getting louder. "Everyone knows what you're doing, Evelyn. Everyone knows what you really are." The crowd had gone quiet, all attention focused on them now. This was it, Thornton's plan. Public humiliation, social destruction, turning the town against them through scandal and innuendo. Evelyn opened her mouth to respond, but Silas spoke first. "That's enough." His voice was quiet, but carried authority. "You want to insult me? Fine. But you leave her alone." "Why? You think you're protecting her? You're ruining her. She could have had a respectable life if she'd had any sense." "Respectable?" Evelyn's voice shook slightly, but she forced it steady. "You mean the respectable life where you abandoned me at a train station because I wasn't perfect enough for you?" Vernon's face darkened. "That's not where you walked away without even having the decency to say it to my face?" She was warming up now, anger burning through fear. "Where you sent a ranch hand to pay me off like I was some kind of prostitute you needed to be rid of. I gave you money. You gave me guilt. And I don't want it." Evelyn turned to address the watching crowd. "You all want to know what happened? Fine. Vernon Hadley promised to marry me, brought me 900 miles to marry me, took one look at my bad leg and decided I wasn't worth keeping. So I went to work at a dyeing ranch because I had nowhere else to go. And I've worked harder there than I ever worked in my life. Is that scandalous? Is that shameful?" The crowd was silent, watching. "We're not living in sin," Silas said, his voice carrying. "Miss Mercer has her own quarters. She works for wages. And if people want to make something dirty out of that, that says more about them than it does about us." "You expect anyone to believe that?" Vernon sneered. "A young woman living alone with an old man on a remote ranch?" "I expect people to mind their own business," Evelyn shot back. "But apparently that's too much to ask in Blackstone Ridge." A new voice cut through the tension. "Maybe the boy's asking the wrong questions." Richard Thornton himself stepped into the circle that had formed around them, dressed in expensive clothes and radiating quiet confidence. The crowd shifted to make room for him. "The real question," Thornton continued smoothly, "is why anyone would choose to defend a ranch that's clearly failing. Why hold on to something that's dying when you could take fair payment and start fresh somewhere else?" "Because it's mine," Silas said flatly. "Is it? I've been looking into the land records. There seem to be some irregularities in your claim." "There are no irregularities. I've owned Cross Creek for 8 years." "Perhaps. But without proper documentation, ownership becomes questionable." Thornton smiled slightly. "I'd hate to see you lose everything because of a paperwork error. So that was the real play. Not just social pressure, but a legal challenge to the land claim itself." Evelyn felt her heart sink. Before Silas could respond to Thornton's threat, another voice rang out from the crowd. "That's a lie!" Everyone turned. An elderly man was pushing through the gathering, Ezra Dalton, the town clerk, bent with age but sharp-eyed. He'd been around Blackstone Ridge longer than anyone could remember, had filed every land claim and deed for 30 years. "I filed Silas Granger's claim myself," Ezra said, his voice cracking but firm. 1878. All proper and legal, no irregularities. Thornton's smile didn't waver, but something flickered in his eyes. "Mr. Dalton, you're elderly. Perhaps your memory." "My memory's fine. Better than yours, apparently, since I also remember filing your daddy's claim and watching him try the same tricks you're pulling now." Ezra pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "I brought the documentation. Figured somebody might need it." He handed the paper to Silas, who unfolded it with shaking hands. The land deed, official and notarized, exactly as Ezra said. Thornton's expression hardened. That doesn't change the fact that Cross Creek Ranch is failing. Everyone here knows it. Why protect something that's already dead? Because it's not dead. This voice was new. Margaret Stone, the cattle buyer who'd helped them months ago, stepping forward from where she'd been watching. I was out at Cross Creek 3 weeks ago. They've got healthy cattle, crops coming in, decent operation for their size, better than some ranches twice their acreage. You were there 3 weeks ago? Thornton's tone sharpened. Interesting, doing business with them despite the territory understanding that Cross Creek was off limits? I don't take orders from you about who I trade with. Margaret crossed her arms. And last I checked, this was still open territory. You don't own every ranch and every business, much as you'd like to. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Evelyn could see the calculation on Thornton's face. This wasn't going the way he'd planned. He'd expected public condemnation, social isolation, easy victory. Instead, he was getting pushback from people he couldn't easily intimidate. The fact remains, Thornton said, addressing the crowd now rather than Silas directly, that Miss Mercer's presence at Cross Creek is improper. A young woman living alone with an unmarried man. She's not alone, another voice interrupted. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, looking uncomfortable but determined. I've been out there. She has her own quarters, separate entrance, proper arrangements. More proper than half the so-called respectable households in this town. You're defending them now? Vernon looked at Mrs. Patterson incredulously. After you fired her. I fired her because you and your boss threatened my business. Mrs. Patterson's voice was tight. But that doesn't mean I agreed with it, and I'm tired of watching good people get crushed because one man wants to own everything. The crowd was shifting now. Evelyn could feel it, not necessarily in their favor, but away from Thornton's certainty. People were looking at each other, reconsidering, questioning. Thornton must have felt it too because his expression turned cold. Fine. You want to defend them? Then you can suffer alongside them. Anyone who does business with Cross Creek Ranch is cut off from the Triple R. No trade, no cooperation, nothing. That's illegal, Ezra said sharply. You can't. I can do whatever I want. I own half this territory, and the other half depends on me for their livelihoods. Thornton's voice carried across the square. So make your choice, all of you. Side with two stubborn fools clinging to a dying dream, or side with the man who actually makes this territory run. It was a bold play, putting everyone on the spot, forcing them to choose sides publicly. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Tom Bailey stepped forward. I'll side with them, the young ranch hand said, his voice shaking but determined. I'll work for Cross Creek, for free, if I have to. You're fired, Vernon said immediately. Worth it. Another person stepped forward, a farmer Evelyn didn't recognize. Then another. Then a woman who ran a small trading post on the edge of town. Not everyone, not even most people, but enough. Enough to show that Thornton's control wasn't absolute, that fear wasn't the only force that motivated people. Thornton's face was like stone. You're all making a mistake. Maybe, Silas said quietly, but it's our mistake to make. For a moment, Evelyn thought Thornton might actually lose his composure, might lash out in a way that would reveal the ugliness beneath his polished exterior. But he was too controlled for that. Instead, he simply nodded once, turned, and walked away, his men following. The crowd began to disperse slowly, people drifting back to the festival activities. Though the mood had changed, Evelyn felt like she might collapse, all the tension draining out at once, leaving her hollow and shaking. Mrs. Patterson approached them cautiously. I'm sorry. About before. About being a coward. You weren't a coward, Evelyn said. You were protecting your livelihood. Still feels like cowardice. The older woman paused. That job offer stands if you want it, and I don't care what Thornton says about it. Thank you, but I think I'm needed at the ranch. Tom Bailey was next, looking nervous and excited and terrified all at once. I meant what I said. I'll work for you. I know I'm not much use, but I can learn. Silas shook the kid's hand. We can't pay much. Don't need much, just need to feel like I'm doing something right for once. Over the next hour, several other people came up to offer support. Some offering to trade goods, others promising to spread the word that Cross Creek was open for business despite Thornton's decree. It wasn't a flood of support, but it was something. More than Evelyn had dared hope for. As they were preparing to leave, Vernon approached one last time. He looked defeated, smaller somehow than he had earlier. "I'm sorry," he said to Evelyn, "for all of it. For being a coward when you got off that train, for going along with Thornton's schemes, for everything." Evelyn studied his face, trying to find anger and discovering she was too tired for it. "You made your choices. I made mine. Your choices were braver. My choices were desperate. There's a difference." Vernon nodded slowly. "For what it's worth, I think Silas is lucky to have you." After he walked away, Silas turned to Evelyn with a strange expression. "You ever regret it? Staying?" "Every day," she said honestly, "and not once." The ride back to Cross Creek felt different than the ride into town. The same dusty road, the same aching leg, but something had shifted. They'd stood in front of the whole territory and refused to back down, and some people had stood with them. Not everyone, but enough. Tom Bailey rode with them, his few possessions tied to his saddle, ready to start work immediately. He was young and inexperienced, but he was willing, and that counted for something. Over the following weeks, the ranch began to change in small ways. Tom proved useful despite his inexperience. He was strong, tireless, and eager to learn. With an extra pair of hands, projects that had languished for months finally got done. The barn roof was fully repaired. The fences were reinforced. The cattle were properly tended. But more than that, other people started showing up. The farmer who'd stepped forward at the festival brought seed to trade for future crops. Margaret Stone came back with another cattle buyer, introducing them to Silas and vouching for his stock. A traveling merchant made a special detour to sell them supplies at fair prices. No Thornton markup. It wasn't prosperity, not yet, but it was survival with a margin for error. And that margin made all the difference. Thornton didn't give up, of course. He was too proud and too powerful for that. But his tactics changed. Less direct sabotage, more subtle pressure. The stolen cattle stopped disappearing, though Evelyn suspected that had more to do with witnesses than conscience. Instead, Thornton focused on economic pressure, trying to undercut Cross Creek's prices, spread rumors about their cattle quality, make business harder without making it impossible. They adapted. Silas started dealing with buyers outside the territory, people Thornton couldn't intimidate. Evelyn began keeping meticulous records of everything, every transaction, every head of cattle, every bushel of grain, so accusations of impropriety would have documentation to counter them. And slowly, painfully, Cross Creek Ranch stabilized. The crops came in better than expected that fall. Not a huge harvest, but solid enough to feed them through winter with surplus to sell. The calf born in March had grown into a healthy heifer. 3 more calves were born over the summer. The herd was rebuilding. One evening in late September, Silas called Evelyn out to the porch after dinner. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple that never stopped being beautiful, no matter how many times you saw them. "I've been thinking," he said. "That's usually dangerous." He smiled slightly. "This ranch is doing better. We're not rich, probably never will be, but we're stable. We're surviving. We are. And I've been thinking about what that means, about what we're building here." He paused, looking uncomfortable. "About what we are to each other." Evelyn's heart started beating faster. "What are we?" "Partners, I hope. In the ranch, in the work, in all of it." He turned to face her directly. "But I want it to be official, legal. I want—" He took a breath. "I want to marry you, Evelyn, if you'll have me." She'd known this conversation was coming eventually, had felt it building for months, but hearing the actual words still made her throat tight. "Why?" she asked. "Why?" He looked surprised by the question. "You could have any woman in the territory, someone younger, prettier, without a bad leg and a ruined reputation." "I don't want any woman in the territory. I want you." His voice was firm. "You're the strongest person I've ever met. You make me want to be better. You make me believe things are possible when everything says they're not. And He struggled for words. "I love you. Have for months, probably. Just took me this long to admit it." Evelyn felt tears burning in her eyes. "I can't dance at our wedding. Don't care. I'll probably never be able to give you children. Don't care about that either. People will talk. Say you're settling. Say I trapped you. Let them talk. He reached for her hand. I'm asking you to marry me because I want to spend whatever life I have left working beside you, fighting beside you, building something that matters beside you. Everything else is just noise. Evelyn looked at their joined hands, hers scarred from work, his calloused and weathered. Not romantic by any conventional measure, but real in a way that mattered more than romance. Yes, she said, I'll marry you. They got married in October, a small ceremony in the church where Evelyn had first sought shelter a year ago. Most of the territory showed up, not everyone, but enough to fill the pews and overflow into the yard. Mrs. Patterson cried. Tom Bailey stood as witness. Even Ezra Dalton made the trip despite his age, bringing the marriage certificate to file properly. Vernon Hadley attended too, standing in the back, and left before the reception without speaking to anyone. Thornton didn't come, but nobody expected him to. Evelyn wore a simple dress that Mrs. Patterson had helped her make, nothing fancy but clean and new. Silas wore his good suit and looked nervous in a way that made her love him more. When the Reverend asked if she took this man, she said yes without hesitation, and meant it with every part of herself. The reception was held at Cross Creek Ranch, everyone bringing food and drink, turning it into an impromptu celebration that lasted well into the evening. People danced in the yard. Evelyn watched from the porch, her leg propped up, smiling at the joy she'd helped create. Silas sat beside her. You could try dancing. I'd help you. I'd rather sit here with you. Fair enough. They watched the celebration together, this community that had formed around their stubborn refusal to quit. It wasn't the future Evelyn had imagined when she'd stepped off that train. It was harder, messier, more uncertain. But it was real, and it was hers. And that made it more valuable than any fantasy could have been. The years that followed weren't easy. Ranching never was, and fighting Thornton's continued interference added an extra layer of difficulty. But Cross Creek survived and eventually thrived. The herd grew, the crops improved, they built a new barn to replace the burned one, then added additional structures. Tom Bailey became foreman after 3 years, proving himself invaluable. Other ranchers started following their model, smaller operations banding together, trading fairly with each other, refusing to be bullied by the big outfits. It didn't topple Thornton's empire, but it created alternatives, options, ways to survive without his approval. Evelyn never did work in town again, but she became known throughout the territory as someone you could trust. Fair in her dealings, honest in her assessments, tough but compassionate. Young women started coming to her for advice, seeing in her proof that there were paths forward even when the conventional routes closed off. She and Silas never had children, but the ranch became home to a steady stream of strays, young people with nowhere else to go, workers down on their luck, families fleeing bad situations. They'd stay a season or a year, work in exchange for room and board, then move on when they were ready. Some stayed longer. A few never left. 5 years after their wedding, Thornton tried one last time to buy Cross Creek. He rode out personally with an offer of $5,000, a fortune, more than the ranch was probably worth. Silas didn't even consider it. Not for sale. Everything's for sale at the right price. Not this. This is home. Thornton looked around at the ranch, the repaired buildings, the healthy cattle, the fields green with crops. His expression was unreadable. You won, he said finally. I don't know how, but you won. It wasn't about winning, Evelyn said. She was standing beside Silas, her hand in his. It was about not losing ourselves. After Thornton left, Silas turned to her. You think he'll stop now? Probably not. Men like that don't really stop, but maybe he'll bother someone else for a while. Good enough for me. 10 years after Evelyn stepped off that train, she stood on the porch of Cross Creek Ranch and watched the sunrise paint the desert in shades of gold. Her legs still ached every morning, probably always would, but she'd learned that pain was just information, not a judgment. It told her where her limits were, but it didn't define her worth. Silas came out to join her, moving slower than he used to, age and old injuries catching up, but still solid, still present. Thinking deep thoughts, he asked. Thinking about how lost I felt when I got here. How small. You were never small. I felt small. Like I didn't matter. Like I'd never matter. She leaned against him. You changed that. We changed each other. And that was the truth of it, really. Cross Creek Ranch hadn't saved Evelyn, and Evelyn hadn't saved the ranch. They'd saved each other through the simple act of refusing to quit, of choosing to matter, even when the world said they shouldn't. The desert stretched out before them, harsh and beautiful and unforgiving. But they'd learned to read it, to work with it instead of against it, to find water in dry places and growth in hard soil. The ranch would never be the biggest or the richest in the territory, but it would be theirs, built on stubbornness and hope and the radical belief that broken things could still be valuable. A wagon was coming up the road, dust trailing behind it. Visitors, probably. They got a lot of those now. People had heard about the crippled woman and the dying rancher who'd built something lasting out of nothing, and they came to see if the story was true. Evelyn smiled. Let them come. Let them see what happened when you refused to believe the lies people told about your worth. Let them see what was possible when you found someone who saw your strength instead of your limitations. Because that was the real story of Cross Creek Ranch. Not about overcoming disability or defeating villains, but about two people who decided that the life they were building together mattered more than the opinions of those who'd already written them off. It was about the radical act of choosing yourself, of believing you deserved space in the world even when everything said otherwise. The wagon was getting closer. Silas went inside to put coffee on. They'd need it if they were having visitors. Evelyn stayed on the porch a moment longer, breathing in the morning air, feeling the familiar ache in her leg, and smiling. She'd come to Arizona broken and desperate, believing she was worth nothing more than whatever scraps someone might throw her way. She'd learned different. Worth wasn't something granted by others. It was something you claimed for yourself, day by day, choice by choice, through the simple act of showing up and doing the work. The wagon pulled into the yard. A young family by the looks of it, tired, dusty, probably running from something. Evelyn recognized that look. She'd worn it herself once. She went to greet them, already planning where they could stay, what work needed doing, how they might fit into the rhythm of the ranch. Silas would grumble about taking in more strays, but he'd do it anyway. They always did, because Cross Creek Ranch had become more than a property or a business. It had become proof, living, breathing proof, that the people society discarded weren't actually worthless. They were just waiting for someone to see past the surface, to recognize the strength hiding beneath the damage. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, that someone was yourself. The young woman in his wagon was limping as she climbed down. Evelyn noticed it immediately, saw the way the woman tried to hide it, the shame and defiance mixing on her face. She knew that feeling intimately. "Welcome to Cross Creek," Evelyn said, extending her hand. "Looks like you've had a long journey." The woman took her hand hesitantly. "We're looking for work, any kind. We can pay our way." "We'll figure something out," Evelyn smiled. "Come on inside. Let's get you settled." As she led them toward the house, she caught Silas watching from the doorway, a knowing smile on his face. He understood what this was. The cycle continuing, one generation of strays helping the next. The ranch would keep growing, keep changing, keep opening its doors to people who needed a place to prove themselves. And maybe someday, decades from now, someone would tell the story of Cross Creek Ranch and the woman who'd been abandoned at a train station and somehow built a legacy anyway. But that wasn't the important part. The important part was happening right now, in this moment, in the simple act of welcoming someone home. Because in the end, that's what Cross Creek had become. Not just a ranch, but a testament to the idea that home wasn't something you were born into or given. It was something you fought for, built with your own hands, earned through the stubborn refusal to believe you didn't deserve it. Evelyn had arrived in Blackstone Ridge believing she was the bride nobody wanted. She'd become instead the woman who taught others that wanting yourself was enough, that your worth wasn't determined by who accepted you, but by what you built when they didn't. The desert sun climbed higher, burning away the morning coolness, promising another day of heat and hard work. But Evelyn had learned to love the desert, its honesty, its refusal to pretend to be anything other than what it was. In its harsh beauty, she'd found something that matched the landscape of her own life. Difficult, unforgiving, but capable of nurturing unexpected growth. She looked back once at the porch where she'd sat so many mornings, at the fields she'd planted, at the life she'd claimed for herself against all odds. Then she turned toward the house, toward the people waiting inside, toward the future that was still being written. And she walked forward without shame, Her limp just another part of who she was, neither hidden nor apologized for, simply accepted as the mark of a journey survived, and a woman who'd learned that broken things could still be whole.